for those of you that don't know anything about the Arizona ground game, or a little bit, we have a huge concern for our community, for our family, for the future of Arizona. And that's what brought 12 of us together after the election in 2016. We're completely desert roots, and we are all from Tucson, and everything we do is about Arizona, because we feel that that's where we have the most impact. I want to thank, we're all volunteers. So every one of us is volunteers. We're not connected to any organization financially, as well as our speakers are volunteers. Joel and Imelda, they take up their time to come tonight to speak, and they'll be introduced in just a little bit. Our forums are held all over town. We go where there's space available to us. This is the first time, and we wanted to thank Pueblo High School for offering us this beautiful space. It's the first time we have cushy chairs. We usually have hard chairs. And then our next forum in August is going to be about immigration. It'll be very interesting. We have no idea where it's going to be, but when we find out, we'll send out an invite. Everyone's signed in with their email address, and you'll get an invite by email. A big thank you to all of our community partners. So we feel that if we are going to make any difference, significant difference, when it comes to voting and outreach, it's because we are going to be collaborating, and we are collaborating. It's a really wonderful process to get to meet these wonderful organizations and the volunteers that are in these organizations. So I want to give a big shout out to PDA, Progressive Democrats of Tucson, of Arizona, represent the AZ, the legislative districts 3 and 9 and 10, the YWCA, Justice Alliance, Outlaw Dirty Money, No on 305. Stephanie is outside about the No on 305. Indivisible and the Pima Area Labor Foundation. Big thank you to them for what they do for. There she is. The Pima Area Labor Foundation, we want to thank them for their delicious snacks that they provided, and also for the work that they do protecting workers in Arizona. The Arizona ground game has several goals. We want to encourage everyone to be an active citizen, and the part of being an active citizen is a little bit of education. So this piece, our forums, is the education piece. We have been holding them every month since we started, and we've covered subjects from gerrymandering to education to affordable housing, a whole gamut of things that directly affect and impact our lives. By attending these forums, we hope what you will do is that you'll share some of this information with your neighbors. I think the concept of stronger together was abused a little bit in the last campaign, but really it is true. If we build community together, we are stronger. And this 30-year campaign of negativity that divided us and divides us in our neighborhood, who does that benefit? It certainly doesn't benefit us. And if we are able to and have the formula to reach out in our neighborhoods to our neighbors, it gives us an opportunity to have more strength. We have more strength in numbers, and we have the opportunity to build community. And that's where the power is, and that's our focus. We want to make sure that we reach out neighbor to neighbor. We have 2 elections coming up, the primary on August 28th, and then the general election in November. So those people that are on the ballot that we choose, the decisions they make are going to directly affect our lives. And if we want Arizona to change for the better, then we have to elect better officials. It's all in our hands. Do we want legislators that are beholden, for instance, to the private prison industry, and then they have to have financially be satisfied by filling beds? Or do we want to have legislators that want to focus on improving our infrastructure and education and so on? So we have that choice, and we can do it, but it's our responsibility to know, okay, who's going to vote in November? I would assume every one of you, but what we're asking is that not only are you going to vote, but if you would please reach out, maybe 5 people, 10 people to vote. That's how we're going to make a difference.
So it's my pleasure to introduce Imelda Cortez. She is a Tucson native and she is a graduate from the University of Arizona, a first-generation college graduate in her family, and with a BA in Mexican American Studies and a master's in higher education. Imelda is a language arts teacher here at Pueblo, and she focuses on culturally relevant curriculum, and as well as teaching, she works for a grassroots organization called Tierra y Libertad, which focuses on community empowerment and barrio sustainability. So let's welcome Imelda.
Hello everybody, my name is Imelda. Welcome to Pueblo High School. I'm also a graduate from Pueblo, so welcome back to all the graduates here. I graduated in 2009. I'm currently an English teacher here. I predominantly teach juniors and seniors. Yeah, welcome to my high school, right? So this is my first year teaching actually, but I focused, of course, in Mexican American studies. That's my background and my education. And yeah, thank you to the organization for allowing me to speak here. Right, so mass incarceration really affects the students that I work with. Okay, so there is, like the way that I teach my class is that I never send students outside of the classroom, right? Because I believe that education should happen in the classroom. I don't care what they call me, what they say, or how they behave. I don't send them out, and I've only had to do that once, and after that, nobody else has disrespected me in the classroom because they know that I'm not going to send them out, right? Because I told them that their education is here in the classroom, right? So that's the way that I am involved with trying to stop my students from being involved in things that aren't good for them, right? So that's like my little take within the classroom, right? Outside of the classroom, which I believe is also really important to focus on, is I'm a community organizer with the organization Tierra y Libertad. Okay. Right now we just finished our Freedom Summer program, which teaches students about sustainability practices, teaches students about their culture, and most importantly, how to be leaders and young organizers in the community, right? Which is the alternative to what school teaches us, right? I didn't learn how to be an organizer when I was in school. Okay, that wasn't something that was in the curriculum, right? But I learned that outside of school, and I was able to build gardens. I was able to feed people, right? And that's how we empower people and allow them to see that there is beauty in the culture that they have, but most importantly, allow their families to see that they are much more than a 9-to-5, right? And working 3 to 4 jobs, right? Which also is a factor in some of the things that our youth are involved with outside of school, right? And sometimes inside of school. Yeah, so that's what I do. Thank you for having me here, and I'll be here for questions or anything. That's really my little spiel. Thank you.
Next, I want to introduce Joel Feinman. He is also a Tucson native and received a master's in law degree from the University of Arizona. He joined the Pima County Public Defender's Office as a felony trial attorney in 2007 and now heads this office. Joel also teaches political science at the University of Arizona. So welcome, Joel.
Thank you all for having me. I have a deep voice like my dad, so I'm going to try and project. I think you can hear me, but if not, just give me the high sign. So the ground game asked me to come to you and talk about mass incarceration and the crimes of mass incarceration in 21st century America. So all I can say to you is I've got about, I think, 30 minutes before I have to answer questions. So buckle in, because it's a long and ugly story. I don't really know where to begin when we talk about mass incarceration. So what I chose tonight was to try and begin with where we ostensibly started as a country and where we ostensibly started as a political system and what kind of principles are founding fathers at least espoused that they wanted to underlie that criminal justice system that we're going to talk about today, and then sort of take you on a really bloody and miserable and racist tour of where we have gone and where we are now. But there's a good note that I'm going to end on, which is what we can do about it. And the good news is that what we can do about mass incarceration, bringing an end to mass incarceration, and returning the United States to a system which ostensibly has supposedly been about justice for all, especially criminal justice for all, is actually one of the easiest political problems that we can accomplish. And I'll tell you why I believe that in about 30 minutes after I finish ranting. So, where did we begin? We began with the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, to the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, to the Sixth Amendment, and to the Eighth Amendment. We began with these very high-minded principles that you cannot be searched without a warrant, that the police need probable cause to search you and to seize your property. We began with the idea that the police cannot interrogate you, cannot force you to incriminate yourself unless you're advised by an attorney. We began with the idea that our country from its founding bans cruel and unusual punishment. And we began with the idea that everybody who is accused of a crime has the right to an attorney, has the right to be confronted and cross-examined by the witnesses against them, and has the right to due process of law. The problem is that we began there and we immediately ended there. Those principles were never designed to cover the system that we have now. And the system that we have now is a really ingenious system, whether by manufacture or by accident, I'm not sure, because we espouse these principles, these high-minded principles of justice for all, and the Fourth and Fifth and Sixth and Eighth Amendments, and yet the practical, everyday reality of the criminal justice system is the violation of those amendments time and time and time again, hundreds and thousands of times every day in courthouses around this country. Now, part of the problem is that our framers decided that the most ideal way to guarantee against tyrannical government in our criminal justice system was trial by jury. Thomas Jefferson said, "I consider trial by jury the only anchor ever yet imagined by man by which a government can be held to the principles of its constitution." So our founders' idea of criminal justice was trial by jury. You get accused of a crime, the state puts you on trial, 8 or 12 of your peers decide whether or not you're guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and if they vote unanimously, you're guilty and you get punished. Sounds great. The problem today is 2 words: plea agreements. We do not have trial by jury in this country. And this is a critical reason why we have the highest number of people in prison of any country in the world, the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world, and the greatest racial disparity in our criminal justice system in any country in the world. Because we do not, and have not, at least since the end of the Civil War, lived in a country in which criminal justice is dispensed by trial. We live in a country in which criminal justice is dispensed by plea agreements. There is no state of any of the 50 states in which at least 95% of all criminal cases are dispensed by plea agreement. At least 95%. Most cases it's higher, 97, 98, even 99%. Now, when did plea agreements become prevalent? Plea agreements started to become prevalent after the turn of the century. And what was happening during the turn of the century? This tremendous influx of people who were not traditionally American and who were not traditionally white, and who were arrested on vagrancy laws, public intoxication laws, and even at the turn of the century, what were then the very first iteration of our narcotics and alcohol laws. And the justice system had to deal with these people. You cannot impanel a jury for every African American accused of vagrancy. You cannot impanel a jury for every Irish American accused of shoplifting. And so what the justice system decided is, we are going to put all power in the hands of the prosecutor. And we are going to allow the prosecutor to enter into what's called a plea agreement, which we, the legal system, call a bargain between two equally situated individuals. That way, the prosecutor can allow the defendant to plead guilty to a less serious crime in exchange for a less severe sentence. The problem is that when you enter into a contract, the contract is only valid if you have what's called a meeting of the minds. If you have two parties that are equally situated and that have equal power in that contract. So when I buy my house, the seller has power to sell me the house. I have the power, if I have the money, to buy the house. Assumingly we're equally situated, we can both read the contract. We can make a decision, am I going to buy that house or am I not going to buy that house? Well, the problem is when you're a criminal defendant and you are in jail and you're in shackles and you don't have contact with your family and you don't have resources and you don't have the right or the ability to petition your political leaders to get you out of jail, you have no power. And so you are instantaneously in this position where this whole idea of this contract through this plea bargain that can only be legally justified on the basis of equal power is polluted from the beginning. And our entire justice system becomes a contest between the most powerful person in the room, the prosecutor, and the least powerful person in the room, the criminal defendant. And what happens is the least powerful person in the room suffers and suffers and suffers. So they did a study, and in 2013, they looked at the federal system, and they saw that 97% of all cases in the federal criminal justice system were resolved by plea agreements. And in 2012, they looked at the average sentence for federal narcotics offenses who entered into a plea agreement versus the ones who went to trial. And for the federal narcotics defendants who entered a plea agreement, their average sentence was 5 years. For the federal narcotics defendants who went to trial and were convicted, their average sentence was 16 years. Wow. More than 3 times as many years in prison. And this is important to recognize, ladies and gentlemen. More than 3 times as many years in prison because they chose to exercise their constitutional right under the 6th Amendment, to have a trial by jury. Because our minimum sentencing guidelines and the power of the prosecutor has gotten so out of whack that, of course, if you're a defendant and you are presented with a plea agreement to 5 years versus the possibility of a trial in which you're going to get convicted and sentenced to 16 years, and your jury doesn't look like you, they don't come from your neighborhood, they don't know your background, they don't know your socioeconomic status, and quite frankly, they don't care, and half of them have been watching Fox News, and so they are convinced that by the very nature of your presence in the courtroom, you're guilty automatically. It takes a tremendous amount of moral courage for that person to take their case to trial. Add to that underfunded public defenders' offices, overburdened public defenders' offices, and a criminal justice system that's far more interested in moving cases along than it is with dispensing justice. And we get what we have today, which is the world's highest incarceration rate and the world's highest number of people in prison. I don't want to underestimate and undersell the power of your local prosecutor. So raise your hand if you think that the judge is the most powerful person in the criminal justice system. Well, I think I skewed my sample. I'm pretty sure at least a couple of you would have raised your hand 5 minutes ago. It is not the judge. It is not the juror. It is not our distinguished state representatives who write our laws or our distinguished congresspeople. Where'd Mary go? Our distinguished congresspeople who write our federal laws. It is your local prosecutor. That is by far the most powerful person in the criminal justice system. And the reason for that is about 100 years of cases in every state, on every court, which say that the prosecutor has complete discretion to charge whoever they want with whatever they want and offer whatever plea to whatever crime they see fit, as long as they get a grand jury to indict. And the old saying goes, a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich, and that's absolutely true. So just to illustrate the power of your local prosecutor, If I go out today and I get drunk and I run over a crossing guard and kill him, the prosecutor, Pima County Attorney Barbara Lawal, can decide she is going to pursue capital murder against me and ask a jury to sentence me to death, or she can decide to pursue a Class 1 misdemeanor of reckless driving against me, which leads to probation or at most 6 months in the county jail. And if she decides not to file murder charges and only to file reckless driving charges, guess who can overrule that decision? Nobody. No judge, no legislature, no congressperson, not even our megalomaniacal president, although he would probably try, can overturn that decision. It is entirely up to the prosecutor. Let's say she does charge me with capital murder. She can either ask for life in prison, she can give me a plea to life in prison, or she could give me a plea to 6 months in the Pima County Jail. And if she chooses the latter, nobody can overturn that decision. It is completely unreviewable. There is no judge, there is no state legislator, there is no federal congressperson who can overrule that decision. I think we're taking questions afterwards.
It's not a question. I can hear you fine when you face me, but when you turn around,
I'll try and aim this way.
or use the microphone.
Does anybody else need me to use the microphone?
No.
Okay, and I'll try and back up for you. So it's important to recognize also that recent research, a guy named John Pfaff, a law professor out of Fordham Law School, has done some incredible empirical research which conclusively links the prosecutor to mass incarceration. So Michelle Alexander wrote a wonderful book, The New Jim Crow. It's fantastic. I teach it. I assign it. It's wonderful. Part of the narrative that is developed is that mass incarceration is a result of the war on drugs. That's certainly a factor, but John Pfaff has done some incredible work saying that the primary, researching and I think proving, the primary engine for the growth of mass incarceration is the prosecutor. In the 1970s, if somebody was arrested for a crime, there was about a 1 in 3 chance the local prosecutor would pursue felony charges against them. By the 1990s, the mid-1990s, when the war on crime and mass incarceration was revving at full speed, it went from 1 in 3 to 2 in 3. It is really the power of the prosecutor that drives all decisions in the criminal justice system, including who is in prison and what they're in prison for. I just wanted to address one more topic about plea agreements before we move on. People plead guilty to crimes they did not commit. Now, good luck convincing a jury of that, but there are legions of cases, especially involving juveniles, especially involving people of color who are defendants being confronted by white police officers who don't torture people, who don't necessarily scream at them and abuse them, but certainly are schooled in and employ coercive tactics to extract a confession in which people confess to crimes that is proven, often through DNA, later they did not commit. Studies estimate that about 2 to 8% of all people who are in prison today are factually innocent of the crime that they either pled guilty to or were convicted of. 2 to 8. Now that sounds like a small number, but to put that in perspective, right now there's 42,000 people in the Arizona Department of Corrections. 42,000. At minimum, 842 of them are not guilty, and at maximum, 3,300 of them are not guilty. That's that 2 to 8%. It's not a small number when you're one of those 800 or one of those 3,000. And it's not a small number if you are the mother or the wife or the child of one of those 800 who is in prison for a crime that you did not commit, that you wrongly pled guilty to because you wanted to avoid more time, or you rolled the dice and you went to trial, and as a result you've received not only a sentence, but a sentence 3 times longer than the one you would have received if you pled guilty. We cannot talk about mass incarceration without talking about race. Anybody who claims that we can talk about reforming our criminal justice system or ending mass incarceration or getting a good idea of what our criminal justice system likes, and we can do so in a colorblind fashion, is lying to you. The reason we have such a vastly disproportionate number of people of color in prison is because that is precisely what our political leaders intended to happen more than 100 years ago. In 1866, I'm cribbing off Michelle Alexander. For those of you thinking he's stealing from Michelle Alexander right now, you're 100% correct. I'm totally stealing from her. More than 100 years ago, about in 1866, at the end of the Civil War, we passed the 13th Amendment. And the 13th Amendment says, essentially, that all slavery and all indentured servitude is outlawed. Except for what? Except for who? People who are going to prison. People who are convicted of a criminal offense. So, what did powerful white men in the South, who had recently lost a war, and who'd recently lost, in today's dollars, billions upon billions of dollars in human property, what did they do? They recaptured that human property. And they did it by re-enslaving an entire section of our culture based on the criminal justice system. So you now have hundreds of thousands, millions of freed African and African American slaves roaming the streets and the fields of the South. What do? Well, if you're a South Carolina legislator who does not like abolition and does not like the fact that you lost the Civil War, you pass vagrancy laws, which every state in the Union did. You say that it is a criminal offense to loiter or be a vagrant on a street in any city or in a field in any county without some place to go. And then you go around and you send out police patrols to round up people who have no jobs, who are recently liberated, who have no homes, and who have no property, who are sleeping on the streets and in the fields because they actually have no other place to sleep. You round them up, you do not furnish them with a lawyer, because at that time, and until relatively recently, you did not have a right to a lawyer. You convict them of a crime, you sentence them to hard labor, and we get the chain gangs of late 19th century and early 20th century America. That is the beginning of racial disparities in our criminal justice system. The irony is that our state legislators, our 19th century state legislators, and our 19th century federal congresspeople specifically cited the 13th Amendment to justify this system. They said this is legal. And the reason it's legal is because we have this wonderful amendment abolishing slavery. We have this wonderful amendment saying there's no such thing as indentured servitude. So they were able to correctly point to the language of this wonderful amendment in order to re-enslave an entire sector of our population. That was then employed, those same vagrancy laws, those same truancy laws, those same public intoxication laws were then employed against the immigrants in the early 20th century, against Irish immigrants, German immigrants, Polish immigrants, Jewish immigrants, Russian immigrants. And right when that started to sort of ebb, right when those communities, despite all of the economic, political, and structural obstacles that were thrown up in their way, began to overcome them a little bit, what did we get? What was the next phase of this? The next phase was drugs, which did not start with Richard Nixon, which did not start with Ronald Reagan, and did not start with Bill Clinton. It started in the 1910s and the 1920s under Harry Anslinger and the Narcotics Administration. If you really want to read about a bad guy, about a really evil central character in the history of American criminal justice and mass incarceration, Google or just Wikipedia Harry Anslinger. He's the guy that many people credit with actually murdering Billie Holiday, hounding her to death because of her drug addiction. That he was actually specifically going out of his way to get her. It's a fascinating story. He's a fascinating guy. I could talk all about that, but I don't want to.
Anslinger?
Anslinger. Anslinger.
Thank you.
Now, what did we do with those communities that wouldn't succumb to this new system of mass incarceration? That despite all of these obstacles, despite the vagrancy laws and the public intoxication laws, began to build their own farms and build their own businesses and start their own communities and build their own schools and get a little bit of social, economic, and political capital. What do we do with these communities? We lynch them. In the 1920s, in the 1930s, mass lynchings all across the South. Lasted up until the last lynching I think the last recorded lynching in the United States was 1980. The last proven lynching in the United States was 1980. And I'm using a very technical definition of somebody being hung from a tree with a rope. There's plenty of hate crime murders after 1980. But I think that's the last recorded one that's a lynching in the more traditional use of the term. So when slavery and indentured servitude, when employing the 13th Amendment in order to create these chain gangs of convicts didn't work, well then we went to lynching. And that worked very, very well, obviously, because you killed the very people that you were trying to oppress. Today, and this is a shocking statistic, but I'd really like you to focus on that, what I'm about to say, when we talk about how great this country is. Because what I'm about to tell you makes it very hard for me, quite frankly, it makes it very hard for me to claim that I'm a patriot in the traditional sense of the word. Today, the United States incarcerates a higher percentage of its black population than South Africa did under apartheid. Not flat numbers. Today, the United States incarcerates a higher percentage of its black population than South Africa did under apartheid. And that is not a new statistic. That has been going on for at least 20 years. I get very worked up about mass incarceration, and I get very worked up about criminal justice. And it is my chosen profession because that statistic and others like it just make it very difficult for me to, to buy into the bullshit of land of the free and home of the brave. We're land of the free and home of the brave if we try to bring that to an end, if we elect leaders, and if we back community organizers who are tackling that problem head on. And I don't want to disparage, and I don't want to degrade people who are active in other areas. I mean, they're all critical. Education, taxes, they're all critical. We incarcerate a higher percentage of our black population than South Africa during apartheid. We are not the land of the free and home of the brave. Not as long as that statistic continues to be a fact in this country. White men have a 1 in 17 chance of winding up in prison during their lifetime. White American men, 1 in 17 chance. Black American men, 1 in 3. 1 in 17, 1 in 3. White women, 1 in 111 chance of winding up in prison. Black women, 1 in 18. 1 in 11, 1 in 18. These are disgusting. These are shocking. We get away with it because we do not apply agency to the problem. Well, that's just the system. That's just the judges. That's just the police. We need to start pointing and naming and shaming the people who allow this system to continue, because it absolutely destroys people's lives. It murders them, it tortures them, it kills families, and it destroys their lives. A brief sidebar on drugs. Every single study that's ever been run, all races sell and use drugs roughly the same rate. And in fact, of all people, and this doesn't shock me because I went to a liberal arts college, white men sell drugs at a slightly higher rate than any other gender or ethnicity. So the idea that this is a black problem or an inner city problem, which is coded racial language, or some other problem is completely disproven by the empirical evidence and by multiple verified social science studies. Drugs is a human problem. It is not a racial problem. There's been a controversy the last couple of days about a certain federal candidate in CD2. And I don't even want to get into that, because Joe's got to deal with that tomorrow. For the last 12 to the last 14 years, the Pima County Attorney has prosecuted more narcotics offenses than any other offense. In fiscal year 2017, the Pima County Attorney, 36% of all of the cases that she prosecuted were narcotics offenses. 6% were rape and sexual assault. 36% of all cases prosecuted, narcotics, 6% sexual assault. In Arizona prisons today, the highest percentage of prisoners, 21%, are there for narcotics crimes. 1.4% are there for rape and sexual assault. Forget the political controversy, or I should say the candidate-focused political controversy. If you really want to sink your teeth into a controversy, why in the holy hell are we prosecuting far more people for non-violent drug offenses than we are for sexual assault and rape? As huge of a problem as the individual rapist is, I think a far bigger problem are the political leaders and the social forces who do not indict and incarcerate all of the sexual assailants and the rapists that we never talk about because they're not in the political eye. That's a huge, huge problem that goes beyond any federal election. I have a note here on money, and I'll shock you with that in a second. You're not going to believe how much money we spend on this. It is one of the reasons we fight this war, though, this war on drugs, is federal dollars. The federal government pumps huge amounts of money into local police and prosecuting agencies in order to fight the war on drugs. Ask my friend Zaira about Operation Stone Garden, or Google Operation Stone Garden and read about what's been going on in the Arizona Daily Star, about the money our sheriff's department gets from the federal government to prosecute the war on drugs. Look at the research papers. Sorry, I'm not distracted, I just don't want to talk too much. Look at the research papers which talk about how prisons are the #1 generator of jobs in certain jurisdictions. You ever been to Florence? It would not exist but for mass incarceration. Would not exist. There would be nothing there. At last count, I think there were 9 federal, state, and private prisons in Florence, Arizona. The entire economy is built on human enslavement and human bondage. There are tremendous amounts of money involved. The problem of mass incarceration does not just affect the man or woman who is incarcerated. They looked at children who had mothers and fathers who are in prison, federal prisons and state prison, and they compared people who had parents in prison, kids who had parents in prison, to kids who did not. They looked at frequent socioeconomic hardship. 46% of kids who had parents in prison, frequent socioeconomic hardship. 24% who didn't have parents in prison, frequent socioeconomic hardship. Victim or witness of domestic abuse. If you're a kid with a parent if you're a kid who has a parent in prison, chances are 36 out of 100 you're going to be the victim or witness to domestic abuse. If you have a parent, no parent who's in prison, 5%. 36%, 5%. Living with a person with a substance abuse problem. If you have a parent in prison, 57 times out of 100, you're going to live with somebody who has a substance abuse problem. If you don't have a parent in prison, 7 times out of 100, you're going to live with someone who has a substance abuse problem. So this whole, you did the crime, so do the time bullshit. You know, if you didn't like it, then you shouldn't have committed the offense. Wham, wham, wham. Number one, we already talked about the people who were in prison for crimes they didn't commit. But even if you believe in this kind of punishment, the punishment that we are now inflicting is transgenerational, is wrecking entire generations. Children who, I don't think even Fox News, although maybe Fox News now, would claim committed no crime. The only crime they committed was to be unlucky enough to have a parent who was taken out of their home and sent to prison. Prison's a hellish place. Make no mistake, it is a hellish place. 1 in every 20 inmates are sexually assaulted. 1 in every 20 inmates in prison are sexually assaulted. Our juvenile correction system is even worse. 1 in 8. For every 8 children who go to prison, 1 of them will be sexually assaulted while they're there, oftentimes by a guard or another employee of the Department of Corrections. Let's talk about another collateral consequence, which I think is probably close to this group's heart, which is voting. Arizona is red because of mass incarceration. The United States is red because of mass incarceration. In 2016, 221,000 Arizonans were disenfranchised because of a criminal conviction. In 2016, almost 250,000 Arizonans could not vote because of a criminal conviction. And in Arizona, the law is very simple. If you are convicted of a felony, you automatically lose all of your civil rights. Automatically. Doesn't matter what felony. Capital murder, possession of marijuana, which is still a felony in this state. If you are convicted, you automatically lose the right to vote, the right to sit on a jury, the right to run for office, not a right anybody wants in their sane mind to begin with, and the right to bear arms. And sometimes, oftentimes, it is very difficult and complicated and expensive to get that right to vote back, to get any of those civil rights back. To really bring this home. So, anybody in LD2, Legislative District 2? So, Senator D'Alessandro, right? Senator D'Alessandro. She won her election by about 12,600 votes. 12,600 votes Senator D'Alessandro won by. That's 5.7% of all of the people disenfranchised in Arizona in 2016. If even 5% of the people disenfranchised in Arizona had been able to vote, Senator D'Alessandro might have won by double digits, or she might have lost. Let's look at it the other way. Let's look at Legislative District 23. According to the numbers, the reddest district in the 2016 elections in Arizona. Republican Senator Burgess won that election. The reddest district, he won it by the greatest number of votes. He won it by 33,000 votes over his Democratic opponent. 33,000 votes. That was 15% of the people disenfranchised in 2016. So if only 15% of the people who had been disenfranchised in 2016 had been able to vote, and if they had voted for the Democrat, which I know this because they're my clients, oftentimes people who get their rights restored and who've experienced the hell of the criminal justice system and mass incarceration, registered Democrat, don't know why, but they do. If they had voted that way, then the reddest district in Arizona would have turned blue with only 15% of disenfranchised voters being able to vote. You want to turn Arizona blue? Mass incarceration. You want to elect a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress? Reform our mass incarceration laws and our laws that automatically disenfranchise people. Because there's no expungement in Arizona. There's no such thing as getting your criminal record expunged, no matter how old you are or how long it's been since you were last accused of a crime. I'm drawing to the end. I have another horror story that I love telling. I tell this to my class. I teach at the U, and they're all 19-year-olds, and I love them, and they're adorable, and they don't know anything. And so I like shocking them, because it's great. So, there's a 2002 Supreme Court case. It's HUD, Housing and Urban Development, HUD versus Rucker, R-U-C-K-E-R. Don't Google this before dinner. Google this after dinner. So Miss Rucker was a grandmother, an African-American grandmother in her 60s. This is talking about just how far mass incarceration is taking us from justice and peace in this country, and how many people it affects, even if you've never set foot in prison. Miss Rucker was an African-American grandmother in her 60s, and she lived, I think it was Chicago, might have been Detroit, I'm not sure, not entirely relevant. She lived in public housing, I think in Chicago. And Miss Rucker lived with her developmentally disabled granddaughter, who had an addiction to crack cocaine. Miss Rucker, her tenant was HUD, was Housing and Urban Development, was the federal government. And when she signed a lease saying that she was agreeing to being immediately evicted if any criminal activity occurred on her property or in that complex. That was the responsibility of her or somebody she was living with. So one day, Miss Rucker's developmentally disabled granddaughter went downstairs away from the building, about 20 yards away from the building, but still on the property of the apartment complex, and she bought some crack cocaine. The police came, they arrested her. It was 1 gram, maybe 2 grams. I mean, it was personal use. She wasn't a drug dealer. They arrested her. They had no evidence, and they had no reason to believe that Miss Rucker knew that her granddaughter was going downstairs to buy crack cocaine, that her grandmother gave her any money to buy crack cocaine, or that her grandmother even thought it was okay for her to use crack cocaine. No evidence of any of that. They evicted this 65-year-old grandmother who was on public housing and who had no place to live. And she was homeless. The case went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, supposedly the last bastion of justice and due process in our country. And the United States Supreme Court said, you are shit out of luck. It does not matter, according to the United States Supreme Court, according to the law of the land, it does not matter, Miss Rucker, whether you knew or should have known that your granddaughter went downstairs to buy crack. Because she did, the federal government can evict you and properly evicted you because you signed that lease. It does not matter whether you knew or should have known. We will agree with you that there's no way you could have known. You were still properly evicted. Ms. Rucker is the face of mass incarceration that we often do not talk about. You know, we talk about juveniles who are wrongfully convicted. You know, we talk about people who went to prison and had horrific experiences. But we don't hear about the Miss Ruckers who never set foot for 1 minute inside of a jail or a prison, who never had any handcuffs placed on them, but whose lives were completely destroyed, who were rendered homeless by the system of mass incarceration and criminal justice, as we call it. HUD v. Rucker, it's terrible. The collateral consequences of mass incarceration are nearly endless. You have a felony conviction, good luck getting a loan, good luck getting a job, good luck getting a barber's license or a cosmetician's license or a fingerprint clearance card to teach in public schools. And also remember that Arizona has no expungement law. Once you have a felony in Arizona, some states are a little bit better, but once you have a felony in Arizona, you have a felony for life. So good luck with all of that when you have a felony conviction.
Unless your name is Arpaio.
Unless your name is Arpaio. Yep, then you can run for Senate with the assistance of the president. The cost is astronomical. We spend in Arizona $3,500 per K through 12 student. We spend $23,000 per inmate. $3,500 per K through 12 student, $23,000 per inmate. Keeping one person in the Pima County Jail for 1 year costs us more than $34,000. We could take everybody, all 1,700 people who are sitting in the Pima County Jail right now, a mile away, take them out of jail, send them all to the University of Arizona for 4 years, and it would be exponentially cheaper than what we're doing now. So anytime that anybody says it's too expensive to reform mass incarceration, it's too expensive to end criminal justice to change criminal justice, it is transparently false. What we are doing right now is the most expensive thing. If you talk to any conservative, it's a great talking point. This is the most expensive thing. There is no more expensive solution to crime than what we are doing right now. It is a fantastic way to spend as much money as humanly possible. So, I want to wrap it up on a high note and then take any questions you might have. What can we do? Well, there are people who are doing it. And I just want to give a shout out to some people who I truly admire, who don't give these talks necessarily, but who do some incredible work, in addition to our candidates who were running earlier, my friend Zaira, my friend Jessica, my friend Gabby, Sharon and Jay. Where's Sharon and Jay? So I ran for county attorney in 2016. It's a horrible story. I'm not going to talk about it now. It scarred me for life. I didn't know Sharon and Jay before then. We'd never met. They believed in criminal justice reform and ending mass incarceration to the point where they knocked on doors for me, a total stranger, 2 years ago in about 105-degree heat, and Sharon plastered her entire side of her van with talking points about why and how to end mass incarceration. I mean, that's just incredible. My friend Tiara, my friend Joe, Paul. I mean, there's people, community leaders, who are dedicated and trying really, really hard to address this problem. I want to quote Henry David Thoreau as an introduction to my final point about why you should be hopeful and what you can do. So Henry David Thoreau was very much opposed to the invasion of Mexico, the 1846 invasion of Mexico. And the way he chose to express his opposition to that war was he refused to pay his poll tax when he went to vote, because part of his poll tax went to fund the U.S. Army's invasion of Mexico. And he said, screw you, I'm not paying my taxes. And they said, well, you're going to jail. So Henry David Thoreau went to jail, and in jail he wrote Civil Disobedience. And one of the things that he wrote in Civil Disobedience is one of my favorite passages in literature. There are thousands who are in opinion opposed to slavery and to the war, who yet in effect do nothing to put an end to them, who esteeming themselves children of Washington and Franklin, sit down with their hands in their pockets and say that they know not what to do and do nothing. That is what our prosecutors are doing today. We know nothing about criminal justice reform. We know nothing about mass incarceration. We are doing the best we can. So, God bless America. Washington, Lincoln, Jefferson, 4th, 5th, 6th Amendment. God praise the flag. And we will put our hands in our pockets and do nothing. You can vote those people out of office the next election. And it's different from education. And it's different from taxes, and it's different from tariffs. There's a whole lot of stakeholders in education. You need the legislature, one principal, one school superintendent, one well-meaning member of the school board can't do it alone. Tariffs, God only knows how trade works. I know how it's being broken under Trump, but I have no idea how to fix it. And if I really cared about tariffs, I wouldn't even know where to begin. Economic policy, tax policy. I mean, these are things that take generations to develop and probably take generations to change if we wanted to create a more equitable social system, more equitable economic system. If we wanted to institute mandatory minimum living wage for all people in the United States, it would be difficult. You'd have to talk to a lot of stakeholders. You'd have to do a lot of things. If you want to send if you want to send less people to Pima County Jail, then you elect a different prosecutor. If you want to send less people to the Arizona Department of Corrections, then you elect a different Attorney General. The weakness in the system, I'm going to say this for my brother, the weakness in the Death Star's plan is precisely the architectural detail that they use to make it so formidable, which is the power of the prosecutor. They built this entire system around a prosecutor that is all-powerful and has all discretion to make it almost impossible for a public defender or a judge or an individual legislator to change the system, to dismantle it, to blow it up. But that very strength is also the core weakness of the system. Because the prosecutor has total discretion, you change the prosecutor, you change the system. Mr. Kastner in Philadelphia is a fantastic example of that. Ms. Fox in Chicago is a fantastic example of that. It's starting to happen, slowly and surely starting to happen. So, as horrible as it is, as many people as being tortured and murdered and killed, the upside of where we are with mass incarceration and criminal justice reform in this country is actually it's one of the easiest problems to fix. And the infrastructure already exists. The Supreme Court has weakened the 4th and 5th and 6th and 8th Amendments, but we haven't abolished them. technically, you are still innocent until proven guilty. Technically, the state still has to prove you're guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So the infrastructure is still there. We put different engineers in charge. We elect different leaders who are committed to this as they are to education, as committed to this as they are to taxes, as committed to this as they are to freedom of speech. Then we will see change. Then we will actually move closer to the ideal of being a country in which people are born free, in which we have due process of law, in which we actually do, for the first time, have liberty and justice for all. So, thank you.